Bene, molti mi hanno detto in queste ore che questa è un'edizione del festival particolarmente politica. Non c'è dubbio che si parla di politica dal punto di vista degli economisti. Quindi per un'edizione così improntata su temi di politica abbiamo pensato che la lectio inauguralis, l'inizio di questo festival, dovesse essere tenuta forse dal più scienziato politico tra gli economisti. James Robinson, non solo per i suoi studi, ma anche per le posizioni che ha ricoperto nell'ambito dell'accademia negli anni della sua brillante carriera, si è sempre caratterizzato per essere un ponte tra l'economia e la scienza della politica. È stato professor of government in università molto prestigiose, Professor of Political Science and Economics, questo titolo con questa commistione è qualcosa che davvero caratterizza James Robinson, e soprattutto i risultati della sua ricerca sono pubblicazioni sui giornali di punta, sulle riviste migliori, sia in campo economico, sui cosiddetti top journal, sia in campo economico, sia nel campo della scienza politica. La sua ricerca è incentrata sul rapporto fra conflitto, istituzioni e crescita economica, come il conflitto, anche politico, genera istituzioni di diversa natura e come queste istituzioni hanno poi un ruolo nella crescita economica, e poi il loop si ripete e si riavvita su se stesso. In questo beneficia di una profonda conoscenza della storia comparata di diversi paesi. Abbiamo parlato in precedenti edizioni del Festival di un libro fondamentale, Why Nation Fail, che James Robinson ha scritto assieme ad Aaron Acemoglu, che sarà anche a questa edizione del Festival. Bene, in molte pagine di questo libro proprio si vede la grande cultura, la grande conoscenza, la grande capacità di fare analisi comparata di James Robinson. Credo che si è molto parlato dei rischi che sono associati alla rivoluzione in atto nelle rappresentanze politiche, a rischi associati al populismo, riferendosi all'esperienza dei paesi latinoamericani e pensando che i grandi danni siano soprattutto legati a quello che può avvenire al quadro economico nella sua complessità, ai problemi di bilancia dei pagamenti, al problema di svalutazione della moneta, all'economia. Ma c'è una dimensione molto importante dell'effetto di questa rivoluzione delle rappresentanze sulla qualità delle istituzioni. Questo è un tema fondamentale che occuperà moltissimo diverse relazioni qui al Festival e che James Robinson ha affrontato nelle sue ricerche a fondo. C'è un sistema di bilanciamento dei poteri che è fondamentale per il funzionamento delle nostre democrazie e in qualche modo il successo di formazioni che contrappongono il popolo inteso come qualcosa di monolitico all'elite anch'essa intesa come qualcosa di monolitico spesso tende a spazzare tutto ciò che sta nel mezzo. In questo deteriora la qualità delle nostre istituzioni, distrugge il pluralismo, porta di fatto ad una dittatura delle maggioranze. Un altro grande caratteristica, un altro grande valore dell'attività di ricerca di James Robinson è quello di essere sempre stato coi piedi per terra. Oggi dirige il Pearson Institute for the Study and Resolution of Global Conflict, è stato consulente della Banca Mondiale, è stato consulente del governo svedese, quindi si è sempre occupato di temi estremamente complessi, con ricerca accademica di punta, ma senza perdere mai il contatto con i problemi rilevanti e con i problemi concreti e sapendo dialogare con chi poi deve prendere le decisioni. È un pensatore globale, secondo il Project Magazine è al 30° World Thinker nel ranking delle persone che hanno un pensiero e che hanno un'influenza nel loro ragionamento a livello globale. E se guardiamo ai riconoscimenti che le ha ricevuti in diverse parti del mondo, anche in parti dove difficilmente si trovano degli accademici che hanno avuto dei riconoscimenti, in America Latina, in Colombia, in Mongolia e poi in Europa, in Scandinavia e negli Stati Uniti e in altri paesi. Bene, noi siamo felici di averlo qui con noi, da diverse edizioni del festival che avevamo cercato di invitarlo e siamo davvero contenti che abbia accettato questa volta il nostro invito. James, okay. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here. I've heard a lot about the Festival of Economics, but the first time I've come, so it's very exciting, and it's obviously an exciting event and a very unique event. I don't have a watch, and I hadn't brought my phone. Is somebody going to tell me when to shut up? And could you tell me 5 minutes before I'm supposed to shut up? Okay, great. Okay, so what I'm going to do today is to try to talk about something I've never actually given a presentation about in my entire life, which is populism. Since I've hung out a lot in Latin America, I've perhaps experienced populism sort of firsthand, but I've never talked about it. And I'm going to try to talk about it through the lens of a new book that Daron Acemoglu and I have just finished, which is coming out in September. I'm not quite sure when the Italian translation is coming out, but it's coming out in English in September. And it's called The Narrow Corridor, State, Society, and the Fate of Liberty. So by the end of the lecture, you'll see why it's called The Narrow Corridor. Okay, so let me start by trying to say what I think populism is. So populism is a very heterogeneous phenomenon, so it's difficult to get your hands on. So I just try to distill a couple of key characteristics that populist experiences seem to have. Okay, so here's my go at doing it. I think what's complicated about populism is it's both an ideology and a political strategy, a kind of a positive interpretation of what's going on in society at the same time. The ideological part of it is a notion that there's the people, there's some concept of the people, and it's the people's preferences that ought to be deciding what happens in a country. If you look at the way people speak, it's very common. After Brexit, Nigel Farage talks about Brexit as a victory for the real people. President Trump talks about the other people who don't mean anything, okay? From Colombia, you mentioned Colombia, President Uribe, former President Uribe, he talks of the gente de bien, the good people. Let me give you a little sample from President Uribe's Twitter account. The good people, la gente de bien, have begun to arm themselves, to protect themselves against the guerrillas who Santos, former President Santos, the elites President Uribe is fighting against, have given the country to. Okay, so the good people, the gente de bien, are arming themselves to protect themselves from President Santos and the other sinister elites running Colombia. So that brings in, I think, the other part of this which seems to be very common, which is there's a sort of normative idea or an ideological idea that there's some concept of the people, okay? And the people should be governing, and their preferences should be determining what happens. But they're not, because there's an elite that's captured the society. In that case, President Santos and his clique. So it seems that in most of these populist experiences, that's more like a sort of positive, what I'd call a positive claim. It's a kind of empirical statement that policy is actually being determined by this elite. Therefore, it doesn't reflect the will or the preferences of the people. Okay? So I think there's a few things to think about in that definition. So to me, that's the key aspect. Some notion of the people, and I'll come back to that, and the notion that the system is captured by some elite. So the people that's a very, I'd call that a sort of very non-pluralistic notion of society. Okay? So the people as opposed to who? Well, as opposed to the elite, obviously, and probably as opposed to other people in the society who are not the real people. So I call that, it's both a very non-pluralistic notion of society, and it's also a rather exclusionary notion, because implicitly it elevates the interests of these people, whoever the people are, el pueblo, you know, President Chavez used to talk about, President Perón talked about los descamisados, you know, the shirtless ones. So in that case, the people they're marginalized, they're not represented, that's part of this narrative too, they're excluded. It's the elites who are running things. So populism is very heterogeneous, but this is my sense of what's common to all these experiences. So what's bad about that? You know, well, I think there's some obvious things that are bad about it. Many people say, you know, populism is bad because there's an individual who dominates everything. Well, that's true in the United States at the moment, but it's not always true. You know, President Perón left a party, you know, which has lasted a long time. There's a real political party in Bolivia. At the moment, you could say President Morales, in many ways, was a populist. He talks about the problems of the elite, about the people, indigenous people who've been not represented in Bolivia, you know. So that, you know, it has many elements of what I'm calling populism, but there's a party. You know, the National Front in France is a party. It even tried to kick, you know, Le Pen, its founder, out of the party, and there were rules that stopped it doing so. So that's maybe something we're worried about, very personalization of power. But I think the most clear thing we're worried about is that this anti-pluralistic kind of exclusionary aspect of defining who the people are is somehow very inconsistent with our notion of liberal democratic ideas and rights. Okay? So that's very contrary to the typical conception of liberal democracy. Okay? I think empirically, populism also seems to go along with an enormous amount of concentration of political power. And I think the reason for that is that, in many ways, populism is kind of anti-institutional. So the attack on the elite and the institute comes along with an attack on the institutions that are captured by the elite. So if you want to change that, you have to demolish these institutions. If you look at populist experiences in most parts of Latin America, where they've really taken over the state, in Ecuador, in Peru, in Venezuela, constitutions are rewritten, checks and balances are demolished, the power of executives becomes much larger. President Chavez was able to rule basically without the legislature for years. Right at the moment in Mexico, President López Obrador, even though he has a majority in Congress, he bypasses Congress and just rules through these kind of assemblies and plebiscites that he sort of spontaneously brings together. So this concentration of and centralization of power seems to be worrying from a democratic point of view, but it also seems to be associated with very poor economic performance. Okay? So I'm trying to define populism in a way which encompasses both left and right populism. President Uribe is in favor of free markets and property rights and a small state. He's a very conservative man with a small c. But of course, the Chavistas in Venezuela are very left-wing. So this is not left or under the guise of the people could have many different sorts of preferences and they could want different things in different contexts. So I think the specifics of economic policy that comes out of this formation of populism differ depending on the context. Okay, so that's what populism is. That's what some of the things we're worried about, you know, why we're concerned. When does it emerge? That's probably the most interesting thing. Well, you need a theory in some sense to think about when populism emerges and what you might do to stop it emerging. And so since I'm in Italy, let me start with Machiavelli's theory. Okay? So here's what Machiavelli proposed as a theory of, I'll get to his theory of populism, but before I get to his theory of populism, let me give you his theory of what populism sort of overthrows. Okay? And he sort of says, think of society as the nobles and the people, the nobles against the people. And the nobles would like to command and oppress the people. But the people don't want that. Okay? So Machiavelli says, out of that simple thing, you can imagine three things happening. You can imagine the nobles dominating the people, and that leads to what he called a principality. Or you could imagine the people dominating the nobles. He calls that leads to a situation of license. And in the middle, there's a sort of balance between the people and the nobles. And that's what leads to liberty. Okay, there's Machiavelli's theory. There's a sort of dichotomy, the nobles, I'm going to call that the elite. There's people, citizens, and they're fighting each other, they're struggling. The nobles are trying to oppress the citizens are fighting back, they're trying to control the nobles, and either one side could win, or there's a sort of stalemate. And that, according to the Machiavelli, is when liberty emerges. So let me start by asking, and in some sense that's what we're worried about. We're worried that populism will overthrow liberty. Okay? So let me start by asking, was Machiavelli right? Okay. Is that where liberty comes from? And it turns out that that's very closely related to the new book that Daron and I have. Okay. So let me start by asking if Machiavelli was right and where does liberty come from to the extent we have it? Liberty is always imperfect, like everything. But to the extent that we have it and other parts of the world don't have it, why is that? Okay. And here's the argument in our book. What's the origin of European liberty? So our argument is, if you go back in history and you think about what is it that sets Europe on a particular trajectory compared to other parts of the world. I'm not going to be able to talk about all of the world in half an hour. I'll talk a little bit about China as a contrast in 5 minutes. But let me start thinking about the history of European political institutions and why they relate to Machiavelli's claim about this balance between the nobles and the people leading to liberty. Where could such a balance have come from, and what did it look like? Well, if you go back to 1,500 years to the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, something very interesting happened. A gentleman called Clovis, mostly, king of the Franks, think of him as a political entrepreneur, took the traditional accountable institutions of the Germanic tribes, the Franks, and he merged them with late Roman state institutions. The church, territorial organization, bureaucracy, writing, lawyers. Clovis took those things, those state institutions, and he merged them with these very participatory institutions of the Franks. Okay? That was the start of the Merovingian dynasty, which led to the Carolingians, which led to the Holy Roman Empire. But what's interesting about that? Well, what's interesting is this balance between centralized authority and participation. What do we know about the participation of the Germanic tribes? Well, the earliest description we have is by Tacitus, 98 AD. Tacitus, the Roman historian and scholar, he presented an almost ethnographic account of the way these Germanic tribes, very participatory, very democratic, the way they make decisions. He talks about two assemblies, okay? One is a kind of smaller assembly, more elite-dominated. Another is a big assembly in which many people come. And the assembly is responsible for all sorts of things, including electing magistrates who deliver justice. Okay? So Clovis was a king, but there were huge elements of participation which came from the Franks and were built into the Merovingian and Carolingian state. This is 98 AD. The earliest is his King Clovis being converting to Christianity. That's his tomb. The earliest account we have of how this might have worked in the Carolingian period is rather striking. It's in 882. It's 800 years after Tacitus, unfortunately. But what's interesting about this description by Hincmar is it looks so similar to what Tacitus describes. So there were two assemblies. One was more elite-based. One was much broader-based. Okay? So you get state institutions, centralized institutions. You have elites, but you also have this element of participation built in. Okay? So I think this is the balance that Machiavelli was thinking of. Now, one aspect of Clovis's state-building project was legal. So he promulgated what's known as the Salic law. The Salic law is a very interesting thing, and I'll contrast it in a minute with Chinese law. This is too many words here, but hopefully we can post the slides somewhere and you have more leisure to read them. But just let me point something out about this. This is from a preface, a surviving preface of the Salic Law that Clovis promulgated. And how was the Salic Law written? Okay, not by Clovis, it turns out. Okay, 4 lawmakers, Wisogast, Aragast, Saligast, and Widogast. It sounds like Lord of the Rings, doesn't it? They were chosen from beyond the Rhine. They came together in 3 legal assemblies. Okay, so what was the Salic Law was an extremely bottom-up participatory process of taking customary law, social norms, and codifying it. Okay, it was not some sort of top-down constitutional design or whatever. It was an attempt to systematize the way society worked and kind of incorporate it into this new state. But again, very participatory. Of course, this model spreads, and it spreads where German tribes spread. I'm coming to Italy. England, I'm English, so we'll come to Brexit. But it spreads to England. The Anglo-Saxons, the Saxons, they were a Germanic tribe, okay? Here's, famous moment in English history. In 1215, the Magna Carta, the Great Charter, was signed between King John and the barons at Runnymede, just west of London. It's a meadow next to the Thames River. Now, I don't know if you ever asked yourself, every English schoolboy asked themselves, why Runnymede? Why did he sign it in Runnymede? Well, it turns out to have been very significant because Runnymede was a place where the Anglo-Saxon version of the Germanic Assembly, known as the Witan, used to meet. Okay? This was a place traditionally where there'd been Anglo-Saxon assemblies. All right? They signed it. It's England, so everything is a bit overdone. The birthplace of modern democracy. What is it? When will these English people get their act together? Anyway, the birthplace of modern democracy, and then they went and had a drink at the pub. Okay. So the model spreads. The model spreads. Think about it. Northern Italy. Okay. The Lombards. Who were the Lombards? Germanic tribe. Where do all these Italian Republican communes come from? Same thing, fusion of late Roman state institutions with all this participation and accountability. Okay? There's probably too much detail to see here, but one of the things, the greatest kind of depiction of this, how this worked, or the consequences of this, of course, is in the Palazzo Pubblico in Siena, in the middle of Siena. This is the famous allegory of good government painted in 1338. And over here you have, I'm not sure, that didn't work, did it? Okay. Over here you have the ruler, the representation of the commune. Over here you have justice. And what's particularly nice here is Concord is giving a rope. And at the bottom here, these are the 24 consuls. This is in the Salon of the Nine. So at the time it was painted, there were 9 consuls in Siena. But previously there'd been 24. Here's the 24. They're holding, Concord is giving them a rope. And the rope comes up and is wrapped around the wrists of the ruler. So the consuls are constraining, or shackling is the word we use in our book. They're shackling the ruler. There's a lot of the other imagery. You've got Romulus and Remus and the wolf and stuff at the bottom. But the allegory of good government is a sort of depiction of a communal government. There's justice, there's a rule of law, there's accountability. What's the economic consequences of this? Well, I'm not going to talk too much about the economic consequences of populism or non-populism. I alluded to it. This is also depicted in the frescoes. Here's the consequence of good government in the city. There's trade, there's markets, there's exchange, there's prosperity, construction. There's also dancing. Populism may be consistent with dancing. I don't really have a theorem on that, but anyway. So prosperity, okay? Republican government, liberty, prosperity, okay? You'll see why I'm emphasizing Italy apart from the fact that I'm in Italy in a minute. Okay, so shackling. So I think Machiavelli was right that if you go deep back into history, and of course we could talk about how this thing reproduces itself over time, the roots of this balance between elites and the state and citizens of the people, that is very connected to the emergence of liberty and economic development and prosperity at the same time as depicted in the frescoes. Okay? But that's not an easy thing to create. It's not an easy thing to get that balance. It can be very productive, but it's conflict. Machiavelli emphasized conflict. The nobles want to oppress people. People want to fight back. That's the story. You know, after King John and the barons signed the Magna Carta, they had a civil war, and King John said, I'm not going to stick with that, you know, and they fought. So it's not a consensual, it's a conflicting situation. It's a race, it's a contest, and it's difficult to attain, okay? Think about China. China is very different from that European history with its parliaments and its republics, and very different. If you go far enough back, it's not so different, okay? There's a famous philosophical treatise, the Hunzi. It's written about the 3rd century BC. And here's a translation, I don't know Chinese, but by one of my Chinese students. It's quite fun, so let me go through it. These are the translations of the characters. King, boat, common people, water, water, holds up boat, water, sinks boat. It's a statement about accountability. You know, the king is in the boat. The people are the water. The water can hold up the boat, or the water can sink the boat. So you go far enough back in Chinese history, you have the same sorts of things. You have accountability, you have... But then a new model emerges. About 100 years before the founding of the first dynasty, the Qin dynasty, there's this gentleman, Shang Yang, or Lord Shang, he was one of the great kind of political entrepreneurs or intellectual entrepreneurs of Chinese despotism, you could say. He becomes the advisor to the then king of Qin, before Qin had eliminated the other warring states. And he wrote a treatise on statecraft. You know, he was a sort of budding Machiavellian, thousands of years ahead of his time. And here's one of the statements, you know, which kind of captures his view. When the people are weak, the state is strong. Hence, the state strives to weaken the people. Okay? And that was a philosophy that got embedded into the ideology of Qin state building, the way after the Qin dynasty started, the empire was organized and constructed. It was a victory, in Machiavelli's terms, of the nobles over the people. Okay? That's a long time ago. But that's how China has always been. China veered off this path of balance almost 2,500 years ago, and it never got close to it again. All right? If you've been in China recently, you'll know that if you've ever read George Orwell, back in the 1940s when Orwell was writing, he said, Big Brother is watching you. Well, of course, you couldn't really, in the 1940s, it wasn't technologically feasible. But now it is, and in fact, now the Chinese are putting up millions of these cameras everywhere, so Big Brother can watch you. And they're promulgating their social credit system to monitor everybody's activities and behavior. This is despotic, and there's a deep history of that. Okay? So now we talked about two of the options, the sort of the balance thing. There's when, like in China, when in Machiavelli's terms, the nobles dominate. I guess they did have nobles back in the Qin dynasty. Now it's the Communist Party. The nobles dominate the people. What about the third option? Okay, well, I'm not going to talk too much about that. Where in the world is it the case that the people dominate the nobles or the people dominate the state? Well, Africa, for example, that's the story about African history. The story about African history is a story of incredible participation and controls over elite at the local level, and that worked just fine until colonialism messed everything up. But that's what Machiavelli called license. It's not a word I used in my African development class, but license. So let me not go into that in detail. I want to just talk about this trichotomy, and I want to tell you about this diagram. Okay, so there's you might imagine, if I was going to tell you the story of when society vanquishes the nobles in more detail, you might have thought that the concern for what happened in China or the concern for the emergence of despotism would be quite an incentive to avoid it. And that's also a big theme in African political history. Okay, So here's the diagram I want to use to talk about populism. How long do I have left?
Oh, yeah, still 15 minutes. 15 minutes.
Okay, so this is, I said we need a theory to talk about populism, okay? And here's the theory, okay? So, and here's why the book is called The Narrow Corridor. On the horizontal axis, we have the power of society. Think about that, the ability of society to organize collectively, to use norms, to control elites. On the vertical axis, we have the power of the state. So you have Machiavelli's three outcomes here. You have this despotic, we use this terminology from Thomas Hobbes' famous book, Leviathan, okay? Despotic Leviathan, where the nobles defeat the people. You have, in Africa, what we call the absent Leviathan. Lebanon is a bit like this too. The Lebanese state doesn't have authority. Society has authority, where the people dominate the nobles. And in the middle, you have this balance between the nobles and the people, which is when liberty emerges in this narrow corridor, okay? So I think there's a lot of persistence here. And if I start talking about King Clovis, then there must be a lot of persistence, because that was a long time ago. And I think this path that Europe's taken is sort of deeply rooted in that history, and that's good news. That's good news to everyone worried about populism, because it means that there's a structure of norms and expectations and blueprints for how things work that's radically different from in other parts of the world, that's radically different from what you see in Africa or radically different from what you have in China. So that's good news, but the bad news is that we can all think of instances in European history where societies have been thrown out of the corridor, okay? And I think in some sense, one way of thinking about populism is exactly like that, okay? So I emphasize this contest between state and society. And really, when you're thinking about this corridor, it's a productive contest. It's a contest where the state gets stronger, and that forces society to organize, and the state pushes back. And so that struggle is very productive. We call that struggle this Red Queen. This is from Alice. I won't go into Alice, Alice in Wonderland, Alice Through the Looking Glass. But if you've read Lewis Carroll, it's from Lewis Carroll's writing. But the Red Queen is this idea that there's this productive interaction, but it's a conflictual thing. And that means it can get out of control. And an obvious way it can get out of control historically is that elites actually manage to win, and they throw a society out of the corridor. But that's not the story with populism. Populism is more like the citizens themselves get disillusioned with what's going on along this path to a shackled Leviathan, okay? So how could the citizens get disillusioned? Well, here's an example that perhaps Machiavelli had in mind from Ferrara as a tribute to my host here who's been showing me around. There's other examples, but this is a nice one I fished out. What's happened in Ferrara in 1264? Well, the Republican government voted itself out of existence. In an assembly, they decided to create a hereditary ruler. Machiavelli had a theory about this. He comments, seeing that they cannot resist the nobility in this struggle, the people give their support to one man so as to be defended by his authority. Okay? So Machiavelli is sort of describing, you had a situation of balance, sort of, but then it gets captured by elites. And people decide to overthrow the institutions and create this Lord Obiso as a hereditary ruler of Ferrara. So he knew about the overthrow of liberty, which suggests, and to me, reading this history of medieval Italy, this is an awful lot like many things that people discuss in populism, okay? Which makes me think that, there's some sort of deep history, there's a deep historical connection between the creation of liberal democracy or republican institutions and the latent sort of shadow of populism, okay? So why would this Red Queen get out of control? Why would people get so disillusioned? Why are people seemingly so disillusioned today? Well, here's what I think. it has to be plausible, as it was in Ferrara in the 13th century, that there really is elite capture, okay? So to come up with for populism to happen, remember, go back to the way I thought about populism. Populism is both about, it's a kind of positive claim that political institutions are captured by the elite, along with a normative claim about the people should be deciding things, okay? That's the essence of it. So how could that ever happen in this world? Well, first of all, it would have to be plausible that society really was captured by the elite. Okay. Secondly, as I emphasized before, populism is a sort of anti-institutional in many ways because the institutions are controlled by the elite, so you have to get rid of them. Okay. So it has to be the case that people are disillusioned with institutions. They think institutions have lost their legitimacy, they lost their trust in institutions. Institutions can't deal with the challenges they face. And finally, I think a non-pluralistic political identity has to be kind of potential. It has to be latent, okay? And I think that's complicated because I think people, if I have time, I can talk about it. People have many identities, and the idea of defining the people is not an obvious thing. And it's also not obviously good politics. You know, go back to President Trump's statement about the people who don't matter, you know. Like, that doesn't sound like good politics. I'm not a politician, but that doesn't sound like good politics to me. Politics is about, you want everyone to love you. You don't want to say, no, those people don't matter. So it's only going to be in very specific circumstances that such an exclusionary strategy becomes attractive to politicians. Okay? So I think that's something we have to understand, why that could happen. And I think, to me, these last two things, the first two things are, I think, pretty easy to understand. You know, if I go through them in sequence, you know, I'm not going to talk about inequality. You know, everyone in this room knows about what's been happening with inequality. You know, this idea of elite dominance, well, one way it shows up is potentially through massive increasing inequality. Let me instead emphasize something which I see a lot, you know, in doing research in Latin America, you see this. And now it's emerged in the United States and Britain, which I find very surprising, which I call elite, like social distance, like an enormous increase in social distance between elites and non-elites, you know. So, you know this data on inequality. I won't talk about that, okay? Here's a cartoon, famous cartoon by Saul Steinberg. It's called The View of the World from 9th Avenue, New York City. Okay, so here's New York City, bustling, skyscrapers, and there's the rest of the world. You know, Chicago just about got on the map there, I was happy to say. You know, San Francisco didn't make it. That's the view of Colombia from Bogota. That's the view of Argentina from Buenos Aires. That's the view of Peru that's the view of the Philippines from Manila. You know, this is what very unequal developing countries look like. There's an elite who live in this kind of modern society, and then there's the desert, you know. And that's a very unusual thing to be happening in the United States. You know, I always think, like, you know, what's the difference between Colombia and the United States? Well, in the United States, the wilderness is glamorous. Cowboys are glamorous. You know, in Colombia, the wilderness is like sinister and cowboys are evil. You know, you could never have invented the Sierra Club in Colombia. Americans go camping. Colombians don't go camping. You don't go camping in Colombia, you know? That sounds silly, but actually I think it's indicative of a very different attitude towards the periphery. You know, the core loves the periphery. It feels the periphery is part of the same country. But now it's the flyover country. It's what they call the flyover country. You know, you fly over it on the way to San Francisco, okay? England has its own flyover country. And I know that because it's where my mother was born, okay? Here's where my mother was born. Look at that. You see all the prosperity? Imagine you were living there and, you know, David Cameron was telling you, don't leave the European Union, you know, because it's going to be economically disastrous. How much more disastrous could it be, okay? This is a place called South Bank. It's near Middlesbrough on Teesside. 66% of people in South Bank voted for Brexit. It's a flyover country. David Cameron has no idea what goes on in a place like South Bank, okay? It's the same thing. London, the rest of the country, the social distance, okay? Massive problems of accountability also, okay? So remember, the part of this elite capture narrative is the political system isn't accountable, doesn't take part of our preferences. Here's a local example from Chicago. Joel knows this. This is the 4th Congressional District of Illinois, this red thing. That's the district, okay? Look at it. It's absolutely crazy. Why does it look like that? It's gerrymandered so that all these minorities get pushed into one congressional district, so they only get to elect one Hispanic congressperson, and the white people get to elect everybody else, okay? So this is blatantly undemocratic, but it's there. You know, this is what goes on in the US, okay? So here's an example of elite capture, or a political class serving its own interests at the expense of accountability and what people want. Okay, so if you want evidence to back up an elite capture narrative, there's buckets of it, okay? What about the challenges towards institutions? I think that's there too. You know, if you want evidence on the fact that institutions have done a very bad job at dealing with challenges, it's there. You know, failure of regulation, failure to deal with the financial crisis. You know, the US banking system is more concentrated now than it was before the financial crisis. Nothing has happened. You know, problems of the China shock, like the work of David Autor and his co-authors looking at the local labor market consequences, while economists just tell everybody, oh, free trade benefits everybody. You know, it's just a great thing. Meantime, you know, everyone's neglecting these problems associated with it. Okay, and of course, migration. How long do I have? Okay. So let me not talk about, you got the point, all right? So, elite capture. Deteriorating trust and belief that institutions can cope. What about this last bit? What about this exclusionary, non-pluralistic? Well, first of all, you know, it has to be plausible. And I'm not going to talk, I was going to talk about Sierra Leone, but I don't have time to talk about Sierra Leone. I like talking about Sierra Leone, you know, because Western academics have this notion that in Africa there's like ethnic groups and it's like everyone has this solid identity, and it's total nonsense, okay? Everyone in Africa has way more identities than I do or anyone in this room. People speak multiple languages, there's multiple axes of association and identity, and so I was going to talk about that, but I don't have time. Let me just say, my view is that, you know, as I alluded to earlier, this notion of the people, it's very, you know, in Sierra Leone, the people, what does the people mean? It doesn't mean anything. Like, you could never build a political campaign based on the people. Who are the people? You know, there's so many, all of us have so many different identities that can be emphasized or switched on and off. So I think it must be a pretty specific context in which one identity becomes sort of latent or salient enough that it can really mobilize political support, okay? So I think even if there is such a circumstance, it's still not obvious how it becomes good politics. As I said earlier, you know, President Trump's "other people don't mean anything" doesn't sound like good politics. And that's for the obvious reason, which is that's not how you, in politics, you want everyone to love you. You need to build coalitions, you need to build, so let me not talk about that either, okay? So I would say that this exclusion, what?
No, I don't want you to cut too much, so you can,
but I
give you another 5 minutes, okay?
Okay, but that's all right, I'll still cut it, okay? So you know, I always think what Daron and I call the Niemöller principle, you know, the famous statement by Martin Niemöller, which is, you know, first, who is this pastor in Germany during the Holocaust, theologian. When they came for the socialists, I didn't speak out because I wasn't a socialist. And when they came for the trade unions, I didn't speak out because I wasn't a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, but I wasn't a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left. So what we call the Niemöller principle is that, you know, in a pluralistic society, I recognize your rights, you know, and defend them because you recognize my rights and defend them. And so it's not, pluralism is an equilibrium in many contexts because we understand that once it starts eroding, you can have something like what Nemo described, okay? So I think this idea of sort of, I don't think it's easy to create this people, okay? It's not easy to find an identity which satisfies this condition, okay? And I think that's an optimistic conclusion, because I think it's sufficiently nebulous that it's very difficult to actually build an enduring political movement on it. But it must emerge in some circumstances. And I guess you'd have to say, you'd have to say that, what does seem to have made this possible? What seems to have made it possible? In some sense, as I say here, it's sort of what's odd about this. There's two things that are odd about this. One is, how do you create the people in a world with so many different identities? And then, even if you could construct such a thing, or such a thing potentially existed, why would it be politically appealing to base a political strategy around that? It's almost as if, this identity has to be sufficiently large that it's politically attractive to motivate people along that line, but threatened, also threatened, which is odd. How can you be large and threatened, but I think the obvious explanation for that, in the current context, at least in the European context, I think, in the US context, there's many other factors. I would say, for example, why was President Trump, why is this strategy attractive to President Trump? Well, because it's carefully targeted at marginal district. It's not, Republicans vote for him, and he's happy about that, and that occurs, why? Because of all the polarization in US society. So now Republicans are very averse to switching to Democrats. So President Trump doesn't need to appeal to a wide constituency. He can appeal to a narrow constituency in the Midwest, which this strategy works for. So sometimes, you can target the strategy in ways which make it more feasible. But I think the more difficult thing is satisfying this condition in some sense of, how can, even when such an identity exists, to be politically attractive, it has to be large enough, but at the same time threatened. And it's almost like a contradictory thing. So I think the good news about that is it's very difficult to sustain that situation. It's a transitory situation. Why would that transitory situation have emerged in Europe, for example, at the moment? I think the obvious thing is migration. Is that many of us, many politicians and many academics, misunderstood how migration challenges people's notion of citizenship. So how do you combat populism? So let me just back up a little bit and say, okay, so what did I say? I talked about how you get to liberty. I gave you a little flavor of our book and the theory, and using Machiavelli's notion of balance, okay? And Machiavelli himself proposed a theory of populism. He said it happens when you have elite capture, okay? And when you have elite capture, people are willing to give up republican institutions, as they did all over communal Italy in the late Middle Ages, okay? That's part of populism. Machiavelli didn't use the word populism, but he identified part of what seems to be very common in populist experiences, okay? This notion of elite capture, okay? So in terms of the theory, I showed you the diagram. This is, you're going out of the corridor, okay? You're going out of the corridor because society, in some sense, pushes you out of the corridor. Society disrupts this balance, okay? What would you do about that? Well, I think what I've been trying to emphasize in the discussion of, elite capture, poorly functioning institutions, and, when a kind of populist identity appears and when it can be used as a political strategy, I've emphasized, I think there's real problems here. Inequality is a real problem. Gerrymandering is a real problem. Increasing elite social distance is a real problem, okay? So this is not some, vanity. There are real social problems. So the first thing to think about, it seems to me, is figuring out how to address these social problems, the problems of inequality and elite social distance and malfunctioning. If you go in the United States, you go back to the early 1960s, there was a famous court case of Baker versus Carr, which made a huge attack on, malapportionment between urban and rural areas in the United States. Okay? So somebody needs to address the problem of gerrymandering. Okay? So I think there's obvious things one can do. They're not easy to do politically, but serious things that have sort of created the potential for this populist strategy to appear, that make it credible when President Trump talks about draining the swamp. And let me point out, there's nothing new about that. You know, Ross Perot, a failed populist, talked about cleaning out the stables. You know, Richard Nixon talked about the silent majority. Who was he talking about? The people. He was talking about the same people that Trump were talking about. And the definition of the silent majority wasn't so different. So that's always been there. It's just suddenly become politically successful. Why is that? Well, I think that has to do with, you know, the world changed and these things changed, okay? I think this contested visions of citizenship, that's something that there just has to be much more discussion about. You know, if you look at the Brexit, I'm sure there's lots of discussion of Brexit here in this conference, but, you know, what struck me about Brexit is that the Remain people refused to talk about the issues that most of the Leave people wanted to talk about, you know, like my relatives in Middlesbrough, you know. They wanted to talk about migration. They wanted to talk about inequality. But no, the Remain people just wanted to talk about how disastrous economically it's been for Brexit. Well, you've seen what South Bank looks like. You know, how much worse can it get? So that's, you know, there needs to be an honest discussion of the issues, okay? So there are a contested vision of citizenship, and it's clear that, you know, even in the United States, this is an issue now, okay? And there are these failings of representation, okay? I gave you this idea of gerrymandering, but for me, the interpretation of that is we want more democracy, not less. You know, like when Perón was talking about los descamisados, you know, the shirtless ones, he meant marginalized people who are not represented, who the solution to that is more democracy, you know, not less democracy, like that, this idea that somehow the Brexit referendum was a bad idea. I don't agree with that at all. You know, the Brexit referenda has revealed enormous fault lines in British society that political elites were previously completely oblivious to, it seems to me. And that's a good thing, because now there's a chance to actually address the problems. So I don't think that's bad at all. It looks like a heck of a mess at the moment, but democracy is always a heck of a mess, you know? Democracy is a mess, that's how it is. It's contested, it's conflictual, you debate, you disagree, you build coalitions, coalitions fall apart. That's how democracy is, and that's a good thing, okay? But I also think we should think hard about, you know, how to make the political class, you know, talking about structural changes. I don't know anything about Italy, but if I look at England, for example, you can see that the political class has become less and less and less representative of society. If you look at the Labour Party, I used to be a member of the Labour Party, but then the British government disenfranchised me, so I got upset and I quit. But the Labour Party, you know, when I joined it in 1978, was full of working class people and trade unionists, and now it's all Oxbridge people who did politics, philosophy, and economics, like Tony Blair and all the Miliband's. And those people, you know, would have to put a glove on if they wanted to shake the hand of a working class person. It's like President Santos, you know, it's like the Colombian Latin, it's just like a good old Latin American elite, okay? That's a problem. You know, how did they do that? How did they deal with that problem in other parts of the world? Well, in India, they have mandated representation for women and for lower castes also. So that's you know, maybe that's a crazy idea, but it's a radical way of saying, let's make politics more representative of the society. And I think that's a problem. It's a problem. And, you know, how to get this Nemo principle working, maybe how to get people understanding that my rights depend on your rights, and that's a mutually sustaining relationship. And if I decide I'm the people and you're not the people, then the whole thing crashes down. Okay. So I feel like I've talked too much. Thank you.
This was a great lecture. Thank you so much. So, more democracy, not less. I'm sure there are questions here. We don't have that much time. Unfortunately, we had to start a bit late because there was also the other meeting before. But I will take 2 or 3 questions as usual. So, who asked the first question? Well done. Yeah. Short.
Yeah.
Velocissima.
In modo telegrafico. Prendo spunto da quello che ha detto il professore, ma anche da quello che c'è sulla presentazione sul fascicolo del festival. La polarizzazione della società e quindi l'incapacità di offrire mediazioni in relazione al tessuto sociale da parte delle istituzioni. Ma io capovolgerei, è stata in particolare, chiudo, la incapacità di tanti rappresentanti delle istituzioni di capire i vari contesti della società. Primariamente credo che la causa sia questa.
Grazie.
Telegrafico. Vado su, pronto? Allora, prima domanda è Polibio. Polibio nel 204 parla di oclocrazia, ocloscrato governo delle masse, e studia i cicli della politica, si chiama anaciclosi polibiana. Secondo quesito, Christopher Lasch nel 1994 scrive La ribellione dell'elite, il tradimento della democrazia. Quindi lui è uno che si accorge prima. Il fattore migrazione non c'entra niente, è un cambiamento sociale dovuto alla tecnocrazia e al cambiamento sociale che inizia nel 1969 con l'invenzione di internet e quando l'uomo scende sulla Luna. Grazie.
C'è una terza domanda? Is there a third question? Otherwise, Oh, there. Okay. My question will be done later.
Okay.
I talk to you later.
Thank you. My question is related to emotion. How do you deal with, when you prescribe potentially how populism could be overcome, how do you deal with people's sense of grievance? Because my sense is that, from voting to Trump to Brexit, people vote on emotion, not necessarily any kind of logic. And you picked up on these aspects of, these tensions or these paradoxes about how populism takes root. But beyond the sense of grievance, there is kind of a mass appeal sometimes of populism, depending on the reason that it came about. So people who voted for Trump, all 63 million of them or whoever, aren't all voting for Trump for the same reasons.
Yeah.
That sense of populism cuts across so many different things, racism, fears of inequality, etc. How do you deal with those kinds of intersecting issues, as well as the emotional aspect that is linked to the grievance, which can be harder to deal with in simple policy?
Okay for you to answer this?
Yeah, I can answer that. Yeah, Pippa Norris, who I think you have,
Yes.
who's going to be presenting later in the conference, she has a much more kind of social, psychological theory of populism than we do. I agree with you that, President Trump seems to have this amazing ability to kind of trigger all sorts of reactions and kind of channel it, in a way that I don't think I really understand as a social scientist or social, I think emotion's always involved in politics, and I think President Trump has unleashed all sorts of emotional reactions, but I'm not sure I understand how systematic that is relative to these other features, like whether that's really the secret of his success is that he's a racist, basically, and for example, and there's lots of racist people, and maybe it's not a coincidence that the United States just had a black president before that, and so I would say undoubtedly some people voted for President Trump because of that. We all know how much racism there is in the United States, but there's actually less racism now than there used to be, in some sense, in the US, would be my sense. So then George Wallace, who was also a populist, was much less successful, when he was trying to be a populist. with a much overtly racist strategy. So I'm not denying all of that, but I guess I'm not sure quantitatively how important that is relative to other things. And I honestly, my interaction recently with Democratic politicians is that Democratic politicians are all in denial and they want to blame, Hillary Clinton wants to blame having lost the election on things like that. And I think that's a fundamental mistake because there are lots of big problems in the United States, about inequality and social exclusion. And, you go, I don't know if you've ever been to I was in Gary, Indiana last week because my wife wanted to go and see where Michael Jackson was born. Gary, Indiana is a very scary place. It's a very scary place. And we drove through that, and she's from Colombia, and she was like, how can this place exist in the world's self-styled richest country? It's an absolute outrage, And I just think that everyone has been in denial. The Democrats are in denial, and somebody has to come with a much more progressive social policy agenda. And I'm not going to deny for 1 second what you say is true, but I sort of feel when I see Democratic politicians talking about things like that, it distracts them from what they should be doing. I mean, that's my opinion.
A very last question, because really we have to finish here. So maybe you can come here. Oh, no, it is coming.
Well, thank you very much. It was very interesting, and you rooted the narrative of a contraposition, a conflict between elite and populism in history and the history of Italy. I wonder, the elite, in fact, has inner conflicts. I mean, they're even in Machiavelli's time, between families, between corrupted elite and non-corrupted elite, competent elite and incompetent elite. How does it come that in the last years, these conflicts have not been evident for the people? How does it come that the people have thought that collusion was stronger than conflict among the elites, within the elites?
Yeah. I don't know. I don't think anyone anticipated it. Like when Donald Trump won the Republican election, don't you think like all the Democrats and Hillary Clinton were like high-fiving and, it's in the bag, like people, it's remarkable, the extent to which it was completely unanticipated. And I'm not sure I understand that. I don't know what the social science is on this. I mean, I think, then Trump turned the election into this thing about identity, and he unleashed all of this, maybe emotions is the right word, or somehow he framed things in a way which the traditional politicians hadn't thought of doing. And it just resonated with a lot of people. And I think that was just extremely surprising. Did you anticipate that, Joel? I didn't anticipate it. And I don't think it's just a huge surprise, And I think now everybody is scrabbling around trying to understand it. Political economists like me are trying to conceptualize it much better, try to understand how to theorize about it, and I think in retrospect you can see, as I was trying to suggest, historically it's there all the time, and it's been neglected by social science, but as I said, this social distance, the political class themselves didn't understand. I don't know how Trump figured that out. If it's just random chance, or he really figured out that this was a winning strategy, or that's just, I don't know. I don't know.
It's a question, but we'll accompany us also in many other meetings at this festival. So thank you again for your
Yes, all right.